All right, we're going to go to the 144th Psalm this morning. We're on the home stretch with the Psalms. After almost 2 years in the Psalms, we will be done at the end of August with the Psalms. So, as you arrive in the 144th Psalm, it is a victory psalm. And it's a psalm that we believe David wrote after he became king of Israel. Now, we know he wrote it, but the timing seems to be after David was anointed king, about the age of 15 years of age, maybe 18 years of age. He then is chased by the current king. So, David is the anointed king, but he's not practically the king. And the king named Saul chases him for about 10 years. And then after those 10 years, David ascends to the throne. Saul is taken out by the Lord. David is established, but he's established as the king of really only 2 of the 10 tribes of Israel. 2 of the 12 tribes, I should say. The southern 2, Judah and Benjamin, he's from Judah. So he was the king of those 2 tribes. Yet in the north, the northern 10 tribes, there were some hangers-on of Saul's family, and the north primarily still followed Saul's family. So for about 7 years, David was king down south without being king of the whole of Israel. And so after those 7 years, David becomes king over all of Israel. And he writes this particular psalm as a victory psalm. His enemies have been subdued. He's finally done running. He's moved the capital of Israel to a place called Jerusalem, which would really define that nation over the years. Now, interestingly enough, this psalm, Psalm 144, is largely comprised of quotations from other psalms. And primarily, the quotations can be found in Psalm 18. But it's quotations of Psalms strung together, and it teaches us this, that life is indeed a battlefield. Now, whether you know it or not, life is a military tour, not a sightseeing tour. You know, it's not vacation. That we're just meandering through on the top of one of those double-decker buses looking at all the cool things as a guide points it out to us. That whether we know it or not, whether we want to believe it or not, or we choose to engage or not, we've been thrust headlong into a battle. And that battle is a war that's being waged for our souls, frankly. Now, the question I have for you today is, are you fighting? Because there are people that never want to fight a spiritual battle. So from denying all things God to just making up their own ideas about God, they really want to get through life, and this is one of the difficulties in Western Christianity. We want to get through life as if it's a sightseeing tour, even if we want to claim Christianity. I want it to be as comfortable as possible. I want to make sure I get on the bus, I see all the spots, and then I get to my destination safely, okay? But the issue is, again, we are in a battle for our souls, whether we acknowledge it or not. And so some of us don't, but if you're here, you probably do. Okay, but if you do, then there's a problem with deciding I'm going to actually be a soldier. Because there are really 2 types of soldiers. There are enlisted soldiers, and there are conscripted soldiers, or soldiers that are drafted. Now, my idea of the military was largely shaped by my father, who was drafted in 1968, and he was drafted for the Vietnam War. Now, my father did not want to go fight. He wasn't anti-patriotic. He just didn't want to go die in a jungle. He was 18 and had his life ahead of him. And more than that, he definitely did not want to go die in a jungle with someone else telling him what to do, for he hated authority. So when he got drafted into the military, he immediately had people telling him what to do, like crawl under razor wire while they shoot live fire over his head, he didn't like it that much. So when he finally did his tour and came home, my dad did not have much positive to say about the military, for he did not enlist, he was drafted. Okay? So it shaped how I saw the military. Now, my wife's grandfather was 17 when World War II broke out and America engaged, and he lied about his age to enlist in the Navy. And then he was on a medical ship. There were 3 in the Pacific, Mercy, Hope, and Love. I think they were both, that's what the 3 of them were. But he was on one of those medical ships. And he was in the Pacific, and he spent the bulk of World War II in the Philippines cutting bodies off the bottom of the bay where ships had went down, rescuing our soldiers, or their bodies at the very least. And he had horrific conditions, and yet he so loved the military and his experience that he sold it to his sons, who all 3 voluntarily enlisted in the Vietnam War. And in fact, his one son was on PBR boats up the Da Nang, I mean, in the heat and the thick of the battle, because that's what his dad did and that's what his dad loved. One of his other sons plucked one of those Apollo crafts, the one that they jacked up the whole landing out of the ocean, okay? But they love it, is the point, because of how it was painted to them. And the difference was one person enlisted and another person was drafted. So often, as a pastor, I look at people and I realize that many, many Christians are fighting in the army of God. And by the way, the Bible equates this deal that we're in to us being soldiers. Yet, many are fighting as if they're drafted. They hate authority. They definitely would like victory, okay? But the reality is, many of us would like victory. Some people say it like this: everybody wants to go to heaven, but nobody wants to go dead. You know, many people would like to have victory. They would like to win the battle, but they don't really like some God up in the sky telling them what to do. They don't like to submit. And yet then there are others who enlist. They count the cost. They understand at least how we can understand from the outset of a thing what it's going to entail of us, and they buy in and they fight a good fight as enlisted soldiers. So as we're going through today's message, I want you just to ask yourself, do I look at Christianity as being drafted or conscripted? It may change the way you approach the next season of your life. That said, life is a battlefield, and David knew that, and so he begins here in a season of victory, and he says, "Blessed be the Lord my rock, who trains my hands for war and my fingers for battle. My loving kindness and my fortress," that's what he calls God, "my high tower and my deliverer, my shield and the one in whom I take refuge, who subdues my people under me." He goes on to say, "Lord, what is man that you take knowledge of him, or the son of man that you are mindful of him? Man is like a breath. His days are like a passing shadow." And so he goes on to say, "Bow down your heavens, O Lord, and come down, touch the mountains, that they shall smoke, and flash forth lightning and scatter them. Shoot out your arrows and destroy them. Stretch out your hand from above. Rescue me and deliver me out of the great waters, from the hand of foreigners, whose mouth speaks lying words and whose right hand is a right hand of falsehood." So David is a man who is known for his military might. If you read the Bible, you understand that David was a great man of military might. And so often, we think of David and Goliath, and in some ways we minimalize in that story David's skill with a sling. We sometimes think, well, man, he was just miraculously by God. Like, for the first time in his life, he decided, well, I'm going to pick up these stones and put them in a slingshot and just have at it with old Goliath because of his faith. But the reality is, if you read his story, you know that while definitely the victory over Goliath was a supernatural event, the truth is that David was a guy who was basically expendable in his family. By the way, one of the reasons my dad didn't want to go to Vietnam is he was drafted because if you are of my demographic, and most of us here are of my demographic, you were drafted into Army infantry. And while only 33% of Vietnamese, the soldiers in America that fought in the Vietnam War, were drafted, the large number of casualties were draftees because they were Army infantry. They were expendable, essentially. They were in the killing fields. And David's young life was not so different. David was expendable. He was the youngest guy in his family, so they stuck him out by himself with the sheep. Like Rocky IV, if he dies, he dies. You know, I mean, they stuck him out there. So what he had to do was get good at defending himself and defending sheep. So you could use one of the clubs they had. They would take a rod as a shepherd and a staff, and the rod would be like this little club that you could throw, and he would be very good at that. But the long-range weapon was a slinger. You know, he would learn to sling stones so he could drive off, you know, lions and tigers and bears, oh my. So he'd throw these things, and he was good. You know, I think when David decided to beat Goliath, he had no thought that he would die. Because if you read military history, you find out that no infantryman, which is what Goliath was, would have fought a slinger. How are you going to kill a guy with a spear that you can throw from here to the road if you're really, really good, and defeat a guy who's a slinger who could throw this sucker 60 yards on a dime? You know, so anyway, David understood that he was going to win, but God did empower him. Yet all that said, all these hours of practice with a sling and David's own skill, he understands this: it's God who trains my hands for war and my fingers for battle. He gets it. He put in the time, but who gave him the ability? God, right? Now, he also understood that he may have risen to power over both southern and northern Israel, the whole of Israel, but it was God who put him there. He understands in verse 2 that it's you, God, who subdues my people under me, or gives me power over them, if you will. So Psalm 75:7 says the same exact thing, that God causes one king to rise up, and he puts down another. And so the reality is, no matter what in this election season you're hoping for, no matter who you pray for, no matter who you vote for, the reality is who gets elected will be the person God put there. And he will, whether I understand it or get it or like it or not, he's going to get glory out of that thing, and he's going to work his plan out in our lives. So David understood that. Now, because of this, David was at a point where he was publicly exalted as king, yet he was humble privately. And the reason I say that is this psalm would have been a private psalm of David. Most of the psalms that David wrote that he wanted sung publicly while he was alive says, from David to the choir master. This is one that just says a psalm of David. He wrote this thing to edify himself and to remember what God had done. So he puts down here, look, guess what? Man is like a breath. I'm the king of everything that I ever wanted to be king over, but man is like a breath. I'm a man. Man is like a breath. The word breath there is actually the same word that Solomon uses in Ecclesiastes, where at the end of his life he goes, vanity, vanity, all is vanity. So breath is vanity. It's this. Life is but a vapor. David understands, look, no matter what I attain to, my life is a vapor. It's a in the span of eternity. And God is before me and God is after me, and he's the one who is worthy of exaltation. So he has this deep humility. And by the way, this is a rare thing in the society that we live in. I just went to a fantastic graduation this week. And this graduation was of a group of youth that have overcome tremendous circumstances. Many of them, in fact, all of them, had been in the Missouri juvenile system at some point. And they've worked hard. Many of them have overcome tremendous, even horrific backgrounds. And so the people who got up to speak, the leaders, they were tremendous. I mean, they love kids. And many of these kids have turned around stories because of the investment that our system has made in them. And when they had a person that was graduating speak, with her mom. It was tear-jerking. It was powerful. Yet I'll tell you something that was terrifying. That from start to finish, every person said something like, the power that you need to succeed is found within you. That's all you need, is to look down deep and see the gifts that you've been given and use them, which is a big fat lie. Everything that you need to succeed is found within you only if Jesus Christ lives within you. You can overcome a bunch of stuff by the stuff that God gives us within us, but that's not the only thing you need. And that's not where your strength lies. Whatever skills or power He's given you only are worthwhile as He trains you and then He sustains you. It's Him. And so David understood this. And so what David does is he calls upon the Lord in verses 5 through 8 to take care of his enemies. Now, everyone here, if they do not at this point, will lead something. You will lead someone whether you realize it or not. And if you are a leader, let me tell you what I can guarantee you. You will have enemies outside the camp and inside the camp. Every single day you lead, whether you recognize them or not. And so David has ascended to the throne, but he realizes, God, I still need you to take out my enemies. I'm not plateaued here. It's not over. So look at David. He's realizing, God, I've fought some victories or battles that have led to victory, but now that I'm here, it's all still you. You got me here. You're going to keep me here. Now look at the 9th verse. He breaks into a new song, or he exalts God and says, I'm going to sing to you a new song. Verse 9, I will sing to you, O God, a new song. On a harp of 10 strings, I will sing praises to you. The one who gives salvation to kings, who delivers David his servant from the deadly sword. He says, rescue me and deliver me from the hand of the foreigners, whose mouth speaks lying words, and whose right hand is the right hand of falsehood. Now, David says, look, in this new season of my life, I'm going to sing to you a new song. Now, in Ephesians chapter 5, in the 19th verse, Paul encourages Christians to stir up one another, to bless each other, to encourage one another, with 3 types of songs, okay? Psalms, which are essentially like ancient literature, poetry put to music. We have a bunch of them right here. But in Christian history, there are a bunch of psalmists. In fact, one of my favorite writers, a guy named A.W. Tozer, he compiled this book of writings he called the Christian Book of Mystical Verse. And it was mystics' writings and poems such as Madame Guyon in the Middle Ages that most mainstream Christians couldn't stand these people when they were alive and don't get them now that they're dead. But Tozer loved them because it was poetry, it was deep, sometimes it was abstract, it was not mainstream, it was put often to music. And so he loved it, and I've loved that book in my own spiritual journey. He also, Paul said, don't just speak in these psalms, but speak in hymns. And hymns are just like the hymns we have today, which many of us, if we were in mainstream church growing up, may have grown up with. Hymns are like tried and true songs of doctrine. The early church always had them. These songs that had doctrinal statements at their core, and they were the bedrock of kind of musical worship services that many people would recite from their childhood. And I have those in my own life. In fact, when I think about church as a kid, having been brought up in church, I think of 30 people on a Sunday evening, the 5th night of the worship service on a month that had 5 Sundays, us doing sing night. You know, it's where everybody could just get up and let it rip. And it was always, or you could tell the choir director, we didn't call them worship leaders, I want you to play number 365. And he would go, he'd know it by heart, man. He'd go right to it, you know. And I mean, that's what I think about. That's what takes me back. So hymns, encourage each other with psalms, with hymns, and then spiritual songs. And the spiritual songs are songs that throughout Christianity have changed with the times. Okay, they're contemporary, if you want to use that word. And so even in Paul's day, they had these three songs, these types of songs that he said, look, encourage each other with these. Now, I want to share with you something here, because if you get a glimpse into heaven from Revelation, and you get two glimpses where you see this, and if you ask yourself, well, look, is the glimpse we're getting into heaven, is it now or is it later? I'd say yes. Maybe I don't yet. Both. I don't know. But the point is that every time you get a glimpse into heaven and they're singing a new song. And I think that's important because heaven's a new experience. Not singing the old rugged cross, because it's a new experience. Now, I say that because I just had like a little Pepper the Pastor thing a few weeks ago, and a lot of the questions end up being like, why don't we do more hymns? And I get this throughout, And I realized like there was a time when we only had like 2 or 3 sets of people over 45 in our church. Most time they'd walk in, they'd look at us like, you're too young, we're out of here. I guess now we're all getting older, so we're getting, but most of the time, like if you find people in our area that have been to church, then like hymns are like comfort food. It's like the biscuits and gravy of Christianity. And it's like these suckers, they work, they're tried, they're true, they've got more doctrine than this new stuff. I hear all this. And sometimes that's true. Okay, it very much is true sometimes. But it's not always true. And here's the thing, when you think about worship, I don't always share this stuff, but there are 2 components to worship when we talk about singing that's very important. Worship should be, and I like worship services if I'm mapping them out, to start with songs about God, which are most hymns, by the way, and then move to songs that are to God, because that's a more personal thing. And if you'll notice, if you look at most hymns, they lack a lot of to God. They lack a lot of intimacy, because when they were written, most of them, coming from the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, it was a high approach to God. God was looked at as transcendent, okay? King of kings, Lord of lords, which he definitely is. But what that viewpoint lacks is the immanency of God, which Jesus Christ is right here, right now, friend of sinners. And you need both, frankly. So I say all that to say, most of the time when I approach a subject and I don't want to like extrapolate on it, I do it with what I like to consider sanctified sarcasm, which is typically demeaning and comes off harsh, so that by the time I do extrapolate on something broadly, you're already mad enough at me, you don't listen to anything I have to say from a reasoned perspective. But all that said, when we think about music, I typically tell you guys that, look, we do more contemporary music and very much less hymns, a few hymns, mostly redone, because most hymns were written in 1600s, 1700s, and by the way, they were contemporary bar music, tavern music that were turned into Christian songs. Like they were contemporary at one point, but they're not better just because they're old, you see. And so while there is some value, I think really our worship service, for the most part, does in small part contain every one of these kinds of psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. Just more spiritual songs, because they happen to be more current and they happen to be maybe a little more palatable to the modern ear. And frankly, I'll tell you what, for a worship team that doesn't get paid professionally to play, they're easier. They're easier to pull off. Now, all that said, just let me give you one other perspective here. I'm going to show you something here. Hang with me. Look at that. Now, I didn't live in 1950, but I used to stand by the TV like this. And what's funny is my family would say to me stuff like, back up from the TV, you're going to ruin your eyes. And I was like, I'm already legally blind. Like, what's it going to hurt? But anyway, this little girl's standing next to this. Now, look at this. Oh, man, I remember this sucker. That's a beauty. That sucker's like hi-fi, got the speakers built in. And if you're like my grandpa, who, Depression-era guy, never threw anything away, later we had TVs sitting on top of this TV when this one went out. That's awesome, by the way. It's like furniture after it's done, okay? So like when I think of my childhood, that's what I think of. Right now I'm going back. I'm so happy. Now, let's flash forward a little bit. Now, I went to college in the early 90s, and if you went to college in the early 90s, You wasted a lot of your parents' money watching something on this deal instead of going to college. Look at this. You had just enough VHS. That's what they were. DVDs were in, but you had just enough of these left that you had to have a VHS player, and this sucker was dual. I mean, this is bad to the bone. Like, and you had jacks. You had two little jacks. You could plug some stuff in. You could, like, play Nintendo. You know, you could do some stuff on this thing. And, boy, that's awesome. I mean, I like that thing, too. Now, look at this. Hold on, one more. Oh, man. Bam. Now, in your house, what's your TV most closely resemble? Maybe you don't have this concave-looking deal. I mean, some of you are still hanging on to, like, the big console deal. But, I mean, why does my TV mostly resemble this instead of the one well, Nenny says it's because you can't get the old one anymore. Nenny, stop blasting my point away. Like, the point is, why would you? It's a new era, right? Why would you watch a 19-inch black and white television just because it was tried and true when you were growing up, when you can watch that bad boy? Why do we do that then with things Christian, with things religious? Tradition. It's what Jesus was condemning the Pharisees of 2,000 years ago. You've made the commandments of God of no avail with your traditions, is what he said. So, by the way, as we think about this, here's the point I'm going to make. Look, we're probably not going to have very many hymns here, and if they are, they're going to be redone. And here's the truth of the matter. I'm always concerned about the next generation. And the truth is, like, in church, we're not really geared for the next generation in a corporate Sunday worship service. We just aren't. Like, my kids don't really care all the time for what we do up here. Although most of what we do, you could turn on Joy FM and hear, okay? We'd be in the ballpark with how we do the arrangement. And that's what we strive for, because I want you guys to be able to not have to think about worship when you come in. I don't want to have to always learn a new song. That if you can hear it on the radio, you can do it here, okay? But that said, my kids don't want to listen to Joy FM. You know what they want to listen to? The Boost 97.7. And so, by the way, we're talking about this thing being a battlefield, this Christian life. Like, you need to learn to pick your battles. Like, what hill are you going to die on as a Christian? Is it going to be hymns? Is it going to be with your kids? For instance, I hear this a lot. My kids aren't listening to that Boost in the car. Really? You care more about your musical preference than you do your kids walking with Jesus? So for me, like, I like a lot of the Boost music, but there are artists on there like Andy Mineo. My kids love this guy named Andy Mineo. Ugh. I want to puke, throw up in my mouth, Andy Mineo. So here's what I do. I listen to all things Boost except Andy Mineo, and as soon as he comes on, I'm like, Dad's taking his time now, no more. But every other moment I'm in the car, I'm like, take the radio. These guys are rapping for Jesus. Some of them are modern-day poets. They're modern-day psalmists. Now, I can't always understand what they're saying. I have to get some lyrics out to check that sucker, but sometimes I can. And what I know is this. My kids engage spiritually. They somehow understand every word, and I'm not about to die on that hill and keep them from coming to Jesus. Reality of the situation. Because I don't like it or I don't understand it, you see. Now, look at this. At the end of this section, there's a prayer here for plenty. He prays. He says in verse 12, after asking the Lord to rescue him in verse 11, that our sons may be as plants grown up in their youth, that our daughters may be as pillars sculptured in palace style, that our barns may be full, supplying all kinds of produce, that our sheep may bring forth thousands and 10,000s in our fields, that our oxen may be well laden, that there be no breaking in our going out, that there may be no outcry in our streets. Happy are the people who are in such a state. Happy are the people whose God is the Lord. He says, I want to fight a battle and I want to have victories. I want to have victories. Now, do you want to be victorious in life? And the truth is this. Look, I get it. Positionally, okay, let's talk about this just for a second. Positionally, I get the victory has already been won. Okay, so if you love Jesus and you know Jesus, the victory's won. But the reality is this, that as we fight or we choose to engage or not to engage, the truth is we get our hindies whipped some days fighting. Some days we're victorious. There are people that, and by the way, when we think about battle, there are tons of people that they don't really want to engage for Jesus. And a lot of them come to church even, oddly enough. Like they feel like they're supposed to come to church, but they really don't want Jesus to change their life. And some of those people don't really know Jesus. They just claim to know Jesus, but they don't have any transformed power. They're really going to do what they want. They're confronted with Scripture. They go, nah, not really. I'm gonna model Jesus in church as I want it to be. So I'll pick this part. But here's the thing, guys. If you don't really want to fight, you're probably going to hell. And by the way, if you're going to go to hell, that makes this your heaven. And so it doesn't make any sense because you see, let me tell you something. In the Old Testament, if you're praying for blessings and plenty like David is, it comes forth like physically and temporally. So your barns are going to be full and it's all good. In the New Testament, primarily, if you're obedient and you engage in the fight, your blessings are going to be primarily spiritual and eternal. So it doesn't mean you're going to be rich and have a cigarette boat. It means, it could, but primarily it's going to be what Jesus said. You give up anything for God, give up lands, houses, relationships, He's going to pay you back in heaven. That's what Matthew 19:29 says. Okay, He's going to, for the sacrifice you make, and by the way, war is hell. When you engage, it's going to cost you something. He's going to pay you back. That's awesome. But there are many, many people that sit in American churches or choose not to go to church, and they don't realize or they don't want to truly battle for their own souls. Let me ask you, are you engaged in a battle for your own soul? Because Mark says this, ask the question, what will a man give in exchange for his own soul? Okay, so let me get all the way back to where I started here. If you go to Walmart on certain days of the month, I think they've still got, I don't go to Walmart much, but they got those movie bins, like those big like those big racks, wire racks. It's like chicken wire with movies in them. $1 movies, $5 movies. People in their pajamas rummaging through those movie bins like it's heroin. It's like this movie, if it's $1, it was bad when it came out and it's worse now. And they're like, I got to have it. They got stacks of them, right? Now, that's easy for me to make fun of because that's not my deal. But let me tell you this. If you are not fighting and not engaged in a battle, then guess what? You're probably going to hell. You probably exchanged your own soul for something. And so let me tell you this. That makes this experience, this 6 years you get, this 60 years you get, this 105 years you get, that's your heaven. That vapor. So I'm telling you this. I'm encouraging you. If you don't want to play by God's rules and you don't want to fight, okay, it's not to say we won't take some setbacks, but if you don't want to fight with Jesus as your Lord and Savior, then guess what? Stop digging through the $1 movie bin. Stop selling your soul out for, we live in middle America. This is like the cheapest. Look, if this, and I've said this before, if I'm going to hell, I'm going Motley Crue. I'm going girls, girls, girls. I'm going cigarette boat. I'm going big. Like I'm going Hugh Hefner. At least that guy's getting everything in this life. Do you understand me? Instead of piddling around with like redneck heaven. I'm talking go big, or at least go as big as you can go redneck heaven. I'm talking get a monster truck, not a puny one. Not a 6-inch lift, get a 26-inch lift. Drive that sucker over stuff. If this is your only heaven, do you understand me? Like so many people are exchanging their own souls for nothing. If I'm going to exchange it, I'm going to at least get something out of it in this life. Or you can choose to say, I'm not. I'm actually going to recognize that I'm going to take casualties, if I stick my fingers in my ears and go, la, 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 there's no fight. There's still a fight. La, 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 my soul. My soul's still in danger. Or I can choose to fight. And if I choose to fight, then guess what? Am I engaged as an enlisted man or woman, or am I engaged as a draftee? Because it will matter in how I charge the enemy lines. You see, I think of myself in the spiritual army kind of very humbly as a general. And so you can think of yourself how you want to think of yourself. But I prayerfully I think of myself as a general. Now here's the problem for a field general such as myself. Weekly, my fully volunteer army comes in here, right? If you want to look at me like this. The reality is I can't make you do anything. In fact, when I get a little sharp with anything, people are like, that dude's got no Jesus. I start getting letters like, you need to prayerfully consider your heart because you're sarcastic and you're offensive and you one time you raised your voice. It's like, my dad, well, you need to sit under the Reverend Mike Harrison. That dude had a hanky out because he was going to give you some hell or scare it out of you. You know, like it was a different type of worship environment, all right? So I don't feel very bad about all that. But all that said, like I as a general, here's what we as field generals are trying to get our troops to do. We train you guys to work in the trenches. Like every week we're trying to give you some life application. And what we're really trying to do is have you recognize there's an enemy out there. He's got some of your friends and family. We're trying to make some headway for the Lord. So we're going to dig a trench. And then we're going to get down in that trench and we're going to fight from that sucker, right? And then we're going to, in a couple weeks, dig a new trench. Just so we can stay up with where people are. And what you guys may or may not know is we're advancing towards the enemy. Okay? But here's what you do. You get used to trench warfare. You get used to the latrines in the trench. You get used to the music in the trench. You get used to the chow in the trench. You get used to trench warfare. Whether you like it or not, you kind of get used to it. And you're like, okay, we're in the Lord's army. We're with people. We're together. But here I am. I'm the general. Let's call me a World War I general. And so I'm still riding a horse, and my horse is white, and it's a stallion. So I'm on it, and I'm in the back. I'm not in the trench, and I'm looking up, and here's what I see. I see that on the other side of a hill, there's an enemy living in a trench, and we're each advancing about 15 feet every 2 weeks. You don't see it. I see it. And I know that finally, one week, the only thing between us is about 35 feet of dirt with razor wire and potentially mustard gas and machine gun fire. And I know that if we don't do something, one day you're going to pop up out of your trench, you're going to be looking eye to eye at the enemy, and then it's going to be too soon. Too late, however you want to look at it. It's over. It's on. So now, after teaching you for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks to live in the trenches, to engage your people, to move forward a little at a time, I've got to convince you to jump out of your trench, go through the razor wire and the mustard gas with machine gun fire leveled at your torso and charge the enemy because it's worth it for Jesus. And it's difficult for us, right? If I'm an enlisted man, I stay in my trench. No, I probably am the one who goes. But if I'm a conscripted man, like I didn't sign on for this sucker. I'm okay with living in the trench, but machine gun fire and razor wire, that's not my deal. And so difficulty. How we engage, if we engage. So this morning I ask you this as we get ready to take communion. Are you truly engaged in the fight? Because you can go to church and not be engaged at all. You can check the box off. You can live the way you want throughout the week. You can stagnate. You can, by the way, and I heard this term at seminary a couple months ago, and I was appalled by it, then I was shocked by it, and I was enamored by it. I don't know where I'm at now. But the instructor said that if you don't watch it, you can baptize your own brokenness. You can decide because you don't want to deal with the stuff in your life or you don't want to engage in the fight. Hebrews says that most of us don't get rid of our sin because we just don't want to fight enough that we shed any blood over it. It hurts, right? This thing hurts. So most of us, if we can't if we can't see some victory in an area, what we do is after a while we decide either that God can't do this because this is my besetting sin, which is, by the way, heretical. If Christ died to change us, he can change anything in us. The truth is most of us just don't want to fight over some things as much as it takes for those suckers to go out of us. Some things don't come out without prayer and fasting. Fasting, good grief, that's for another time. That said, here's the deal. We get ourselves in that spot, and then because we, for whatever reason, decide that this thing isn't going away, then we baptize it. We endorse it, we raise it back up as part of us, and then we promote it. And that's as bad a spot as you can be in. We integrate it into our Christianity. So is that you? What have you baptized, or are you baptizing something? And if you are not doing that and you are experiencing some victory, or you are experiencing defeat, who are you relying upon truly? Here's how you'll know. If you're super duper excited when you have victories and you're completely wiped out when things are a setback, no matter how you try to paint it, it's probably you're relying upon. I have found as a pastor, and Nikki Samples always makes fun of me about this because I do this kind of, in the New Testament, the Pharisees, they called it Corban. Like anything they wanted to do that wasn't of God, they'd just say Corban, which means a gift from God. So they wouldn't take care of their parents. They'd go, I can't take care of you in your old age because it's Corban. My money, I got to do it for God. It's like, so they were like spending it on flat screen TVs or whatever. But it was Corban, right? It was for God. So I like to say this jokingly as a pastor, like no matter what I'm doing, if somebody asks me, like, what are you doing today? I'm like, I'm doing this and this, and then I always add, it's for Jesus. Like if you put it's for Jesus on there, you can do whatever you want. It's for Jesus, But if it's truly for Jesus, then when I have a great success, I'm not going to be like, yeah. And when it all goes south, I'm not going to be like, oh, gosh. Reanalyzing the sucker and how could I have done differently? Because, if that's the case, then you've got an eye problem. It's a pride problem. Where the soul that's truly relying upon the Lord works hard as they can, and then lets go and lets God. Lets the chips, if you will, in his will fall where they may. So as we take communion, I want you to self-assess for a few minutes. And so, Father, we ask, as we invite you into this place, that you would cause us to look at our own lives and see, what we may have baptized. What kind of brokenness. As well, Lord, that you'd help us to see if we're engaged in the battle at all, and if we are, are we enlisted or are we conscripted? And Lord, I want to ask that you would grant victory over sin supernaturally, and that you would allow these folks here to truly see you. I mean, you're the only field general of the Christian life, and be willing to submit and follow. And we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.